U.S. policy could respond. So first we'll hear from Dr. Eric Rudenschold, who served for 4 years as the National Security Council Director for Central Asia under the Trump and Biden administrations. He is currently a senior fellow at the Caspian Policy Center. Previously, he was a senior official at the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Parliamentary Assembly and its Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. We'll then hear from Dr. Gavin Helf, who is an adjunct professor at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. From 2019 to 2025, he worked as a senior expert on Central Asia for the U.S. Institute of Peace. He previously worked as a senior democracy and governance advisor at USAID, supporting democracy promotion and countering violent extremism. He has taught Russian and Soviet foreign policy, comparative politics, and security studies at Notre Dame, Cornell, Moscow's International University, and George Washington University. And then we'll also hear from Kate Waters, who is co-founder and executive director of Crude Accountability, an environmental and human rights nonprofit, which was founded in 2003. She's worked with human rights and environmental defenders in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Russia since the early 1990s, and has lived in and traveled extensively throughout the region. She's the author of numerous reports and articles on civil society in the Caucasus and Central Asia, and has been interviewed for print media, radio, and television about environment, oil and gas, and human rights. And we're also welcoming Mr. Cohen, please. Right, for now, yes. Please welcome. So, Mr. Cohen, we've just done the introductions of our speakers, but we haven't started speaking yet. If you would like to make a statement, you would be welcome to do so now.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm a little late, but we're getting out of here today, and any of you who had a chance to go to Memphis would want to. This is an important hearing, and it's an important issue. And what's going on in Ukraine and how it affects the rest of Europe and Asia is important and needs to be considered. We need to help Ukraine in every possible way. To give up on Ukraine is a failure of America and a failure of our history of the last 80 years of being the leader of the Western world and protecting democracy. I don't know if a prostitute in Moscow peed on President Trump, but I do know that President Putin peed on him in Alaska. And that was a disgrace to our country and a failure of American diplomacy. We laid out a red carpet. We had a flyover in his honor. He was waved to and applauded by our president, and he did nothing at that meeting or since to show he has any interest in peace or in not killing Ukrainian children, civilians, women and men. And while President Trump told President Macron, I know this may be a little hard to believe, but I think he really wants to do this. He wants to do it for me. It just shows how solipsistic our president is. President Putin wants to do things for Peter the Great and for Catherine the Great. And when you compare the way he looks at Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and the history of Russia and the Russian Federation, President Trump's influence is nil. So that's what I want to say. I am every day sorrowful about the Ukrainians who were killed, the children. I saw yesterday a children and a mother who were being buried in Kyiv. This is going to go on, and we're not getting defensive weapons to them quickly enough, and we ought to get them every single defensive weapon they can ever ask for and use. And that needs to happen, or the blood is on President Trump's hands. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. So we'll start first with Dr. Rudenschold.
I would like to thank Representative Cohen, members and staff of the Commission for the opportunity to speak today. I appear in my personal capacity, and the views I share are my own, not those of the institutions I'm affiliated with. I am providing you with the written full statement for the record. The war in Ukraine has fundamentally changed Central Asia. These countries are in the midst of a rapid and profound transformation. The war in Ukraine has shaken regional assumptions, rewritten trade maps, and forced a fundamental rethink of security and economic policy, prompting surprising policy shifts and pushbacks against Moscow by Central Asian capitals. The countries of this region do not recognize Russia's annexation of Ukrainian territory. They refuse to send troops to support Ukraine and have worked assiduously to adhere to international sanctions which curtail trade with their once major trading partner, Russia. This is a moment of extraordinary challenge, but also remarkable opportunity, as these countries have broken many traditional bonds with their large neighbor to the north, and in so doing, are now actually able to assert their sovereignty, rebalance their economies, and seek stable partnerships beyond their immediate borders. For decades, U.S. foreign policy has tended to view Central Asia as pawns on a geopolitical chessboard, minor players in a contest of influence between great powers. Russia's aggression against Ukraine has shattered that paradigm. But rather than cleaving to Moscow's orbit, Central Asia's nations have moved aggressively to diversify their relationships and reach to the west and the south. They are strengthening their autonomy through agreements with new partners, and they're developing regional strategies that serve their own interests first. Russia's war created deep economic disruptions in Central Asia. International sanctions nullified traditional trade routes. They upended the region's banking systems, and they've derailed infrastructure. Each of these critical economic areas were tied to and depended upon Moscow. Yet rather than capitulate, the Central Asian countries chose a bold new approach. Instead of their traditional multi-vector foreign policy efforts seeking to counterbalance Russia, China, and the United States, the West, Central Asia sought alternatives to dependence on Moscow, which they saw as an unreliable partner. So they created new and independent banking arrangements. They've broadened their international investments and partnerships, and they invested their own resources to create alternative trade and infrastructure systems. Perhaps the most striking outcome of this shift is the rise of the Middle Corridor. Instead of Russia's northern corridor, the Middle Corridor is a pathway to economic independence for Central Asia that in all likelihood would have not happened were it not for the war in Ukraine. Do you want me to stop? This new trade route is a multimodal network of roads, rail, and maritime routes linking all of Central Asia to Europe via the Caspian Sea and the South Caucasus. Freight volumes along this route continue to grow dramatically as governments and investors seek sanctioned alternatives to Russo-centric supply chains. But the Middle Corridor is more than a transport project. It is a strategic hedge against Russian dominance, an offset to Chinese monopoly, and a platform for regional cooperation and ultimately sovereignty. However, unlocking the full potential of this route requires stability in the South Caucasus. The Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization process is also a side effect of the war in Ukraine that enabled Baku and Yerevan to negotiate without Russian interference. Working together offers a historic opportunity to open borders, diversify trade, and connect the entire Eurasia region more securely. Currently dependent on rail through Azerbaijan and Georgia, adding a second reconstituted rail line through these two countries will more than double the capacity of the Middle Corridor and provide a critical peace dividend. U.S. engagement here is not only diplomatic, it is also a crucial investment in building a more resilient economic network stretching from Europe to Central Asia. What we saw from Central Asia during the first Trump administration was a desire to counterbalance the corrupting influences of Russia and China. Now we see these countries looking for alternatives to predominantly doing business with their big neighbors. Today, these nations are acting more like middle powers, confident enough to set their own agendas and collaborate regionally. Yes, they will still do some business with their large neighbors, but are on their own terms, not as zero-sum deals dictated to them by Moscow and Beijing. So why should it matter to the United States? A sovereign, connected Central Asia is a moderating force that limits Russian leverage, provides alternatives to Chinese control, and supports global trade security. This creates the basis for a new era of greater U.S. partnership and investment. Oil, natural gas, uranium, strategic minerals, and rare earths are found in Central Asia in abundance, providing an opportunity for U.S. collaboration that can transform this region into a global economic powerhouse. And certainly stability and economic opportunity in this region reduce the risk of extremism and create stronger partnerships in an area that sits at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. To seize this moment, I offer 5 policy recommendations. First, anchor U.S. support for the Middle Corridor. This means investing in infrastructure, working with U.S. businesses, as well as your European and Asian partners, but making connectivity a core of U.S. strategy. Second, upgrade the C5+1 framework on its 10th anniversary to C5+1 2.0, potentially by adding Azerbaijan, even Armenia and Georgia to the structure. Add permanent staffing, expand its focus to include not only economic and energy issues, but also digital security, infrastructure finance, governance. Third, treat Armenian-Azerbaijan normalization as a key element of corridor development that will turn the South Caucasus and Central Asia region into a massive trade hub. Without the new rail line connecting Baku and Yerevan, the Middle Corridor's development will likely stall, and current gains may wither. This trade route needs to grow and expand in order to be cost efficient, in order to compete against Russian infrastructure when the Ukraine war ends. Fourth, work to diversify Central Asian economies by supporting the next phase of U.S. investment in strategic minerals and manufacturing. Over-reliance on hydrocarbon extraction leaves these states vulnerable, and economic diversification builds resilience. Finally, reframe U.S. engagement around sovereignty and partnership, not competition. Central Asia governments are not passive actors. They seek balanced, constructive relationships, and the U.S. can meet them on those terms. In closing, the war in Ukraine has made clear that sovereignty and independence are not principles for Central Asia, they are necessities. Central Asia is a region reasserting agency, forging new connections, and seeking global partnerships, developing strategic autonomy. This is a pivotal moment for the United States to act. Engagement with Central Asia on its own terms offers the West an opportunity to demonstrate that the U.S. is not conditional on alignment against China or Russia, but rooted in respect for sovereignty and choice, which is precisely what this region wants. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, and I would like to welcome Representative Doggett, who has joined us. Mr. Doggett, would you like to make a statement before we proceed? Okay. All right, then we'll go to Dr. Helf.
Thank you. I want to also thank the Commission and staff and members for the opportunity to have this chance to talk to you about these things. I think, one of the things that I've noticed over the years is a tendency whenever Central Asian leaders get together, this last week with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or they have a summit with Putin, or they meet with the American president on the sidelines of UNGA, there's usually some sort of commentary that comes out that says, oh, now they're all in with China, now they're all in with the United States, now they're all in with Russia. And one of the things that I've come over the years to take very seriously with my Central Asia colleagues is their assertion of their multi-vector foreign policy. It's critical for countries that are landlocked, in the case of Uzbekistan, double landlocked, to be friends with all of their neighbors and all of their neighbors' neighbors. And I think one of the most important things that we can take about what Central Asia's basic approach to its international relations is that it wants to have good relations with everyone, and it would like to be able to balance those relationships against each other. It's not in their interest to pick one side, one route, one way, one set of relationships over the others. What the invasion of Ukraine has done for the Central Asian states over the last few years is made sitting on that fence sharper. The fence that they sit on is now a lot sharper than it used to be. The good news, I think, from this is that they're always going to be interested in engaging with the United States. They are always going to be interested in commercial and strategic and diplomatic initiatives from the side of the United States. And they're always going to be willing to keep that relationship as strong as possible. There are some opportunities here. The first opportunity that we have is while Russia is distracted and engaged and focused on Ukraine, while China is trying to make sense of what it wants to do in the region, it offers us the opportunity to help them balance that multi-vector foreign policy. So right now, very much it's a three-legged stool, and they've got a big leg on Russia and a big leg on China and a very tiny leg with the rest of the world, with the West and especially the United States. How do we help them build up that? This can express itself as taking advantage of this situation to help them rebuild their relationship and their connectivity to the outside world in ways that are more balanced. So this has to do with, as Eric's talked about, how do you get your goods and your services out? How do you get your oil, your gas, your products out in a way that's not dependent on Russia or China? So that's your middle corridor. How do you find alternate destinations for the labor migrants that come from Central Asia other than Russia? So these countries are very dependent on labor remittances from Russia. Can they find other places to send their workers, including in the long-term perspective, perhaps even Ukraine, where they can find a way to be dependent less on Russia. There are also very important questions about Central Asia's future that I think we are in a unique position to help with. One is, as Eric hinted at, what are these countries going to do in the future when the oil and the gas run out? What are they going to do when selling oil and gas is no longer going to cover all of their expenses? Well, one of the things that they're looking at is alternatives, and they have resources that are important to us, like I would especially talk about uranium. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan together produce more than half of the uranium that's produced on this planet. American nuclear reactors, to this day, even in this situation, still import nuclear fuel rods from Russia and Rosatom. And most of that is a reworking of Kazakh uranium. Uranium is an important part of a future economy that looks at nuclear, that looks at cleaner energy, and Kazakhstan is in a position to do more in its nuclear fuel cycle than simply export its uranium to Russia or China. It provides an opportunity for the West to give them an alternative to selling oil and gas. I think the second, opportunity number one is how to help these countries reconnect to the world in a way that's more balanced. Opportunity number two is to take advantage of what the momentum created by the invasion of Ukraine for these countries to work together. And I think it's amazing when you put the pictures side by side, but the presidents of these countries, these 5 countries, have been, over the last 2.5 years or so, meeting with foreign leaders as a group together. All 5, they go on tour. They met with President Biden in New York. They meet with Putin as a C5 plus R, C5 plus Russia. They meet with Xi Jinping as C5 plus C. They've met with the European Union. They've met with the Gulf states, all 5 of them together. They're very much looking at ways that they can build their relationships together without creating seams between them. When they don't work together, it offers opportunities for outside actors to get into the seams and to take advantage of the situation. We saw when in 2021 and 2022, Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan were involved in a border conflict, that suddenly Turkey and Iran were willing to support their co-linguists, Turkey supporting the Kyrgyz as Turkic speakers and the Iranians coming in as Farsi speakers to support the Tajiks. It creates an opportunity for middle powers to sort of play that game. I think one of the responses to that we've seen is very encouraging, is that these countries work together as a unit, and we should be able to encourage that as much as possible, so that not to allow any divide and conquer. Another thing I think that's really important as to what's happened since the invasion of Ukraine that's different is while in the past we always talked about the great game, US, China, Russia, what we've seen more and more since the invasion of Ukraine is the importance of regional powers. Turkey has become extremely active in the region. They've turned what used to be kind of a community of speakers of Turkic languages into the Organization of Turkic States, which is starting to really take on some economic and security roles that they didn't have before. We have seen a massive engagement by the Gulf states coming in to try to prototype some of their wind and solar and new renewable energy systems in Central Asia as another part of the world that's looking for alternatives to oil and gas. How can they own that technological cycle a little bit better as a group? We have seen other players, Iran, India, other middle powers playing a much bigger role. So if you're a Central Asian diplomat, now you probably spend as much time thinking about those regional partners as you do the big players in the region. I think that also provides us with some opportunities where we might not have as much leverage. We have allies in the region like Turkey who can be helpful in pursuing our agenda. So that's a really important distinction that's happened. In the past, those regional powers have largely deferred to Russia and the United States for other reasons. Perhaps they wanted, missile technology and military technology, other concessions that made Iran and Turkey stay away from that part of the world, but now we've seen them very much engage. Another opportunity for the United States is what, in Russian they're calling relocante, but those Russians who have fled Russia either to avoid having their assets and their businesses destroyed, or have fled because they disagree with the war, or because they don't want to be drafted and don't want to fight the war. We've seen hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens move into Kazakhstan, move into Georgia. They provide an opportunity, they're an audience that we potentially have access to for public diplomacy, for engagement, for maybe working on the capacities of those people when they go back to Russia, when we try to think about what happens after this war with Russia. And they also are still a group of people who are in contact with their relatives at home who provide an audience, a direct access to the Russian population as well. So I think that's an area where public diplomacy and engagement might be very, very important. Finally, I want to talk about one of the big downsides that we've seen. As you all are probably aware, Central Asia has a set of economic, ethnic, and social grievances that have led many of its citizens over the years to seek to become foreign fighters, to seek to activate those grievances outside the region. We first saw this with a very large migration of Central Asians as foreign fighters to the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria back 10, 15 years ago. What we have seen since the invasion of Ukraine is, while there's, that ISIS is gone, we still see ISKP in Afghanistan recruiting from that pool of Central Asians for a lot of the activities that they do. So the bombing of Iranian Revolutionary Guard leaders, celebration in Kerman, Iraq. Iran was done by a Tajik. The attack in Moscow at Crocus City Hall was Central Asians, was Tajiks as well. We have seen some of those ISKP affiliated Central Asians trying to penetrate through the U.S. border from the south as well. But another part of this story is the increasing number of Central Asians who are being drawn into the Ukraine war on both sides. So the Russians are using the strong arm of pushing dual citizenships in the Central Asians who hold dual citizenship into the Russian military. We've seen groups like the paramilitary groups going into prisons and getting Central Asian prisoners out and putting them in the front in Ukraine. We have seen pressure on labor migrants to work digging trenches and doing other support functions in Ukraine. And then we have seen Central Asians appearing on the Ukrainian side in some of these conflicts, even to the point that a few months ago we saw in Kazakhstan the arrest of someone who was trying to recruit Central Asians to fight for the Ukraine side on jihadi websites that had traditionally been used to recruit people to fight as Islamic extremists. So as long as those grievances exist, as long as there is that excess of grievance in Central Asia, we may still see that. That is something that I think the United States needs to track and pay a lot of attention to, because it not only affects the homeland, but it also, in the long term, may lead to some blowback in the region about what the conflict produces in Ukraine. So with that, I'll end. But those are sort of the good news and bad news that I've got from this story.
Thank you very much. And Kate Waters.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you to the Commission, to the members, to the staff for the opportunity to be here. It's an honor to be on this panel. I'm going to focus on a little bit of a different aspect of what's happening in Central Asia on really two issues this afternoon. I'm going to look at civil society and shrinking civic space in the Central Asian countries, and also look at the impact that sanctions, particularly on fossil fuels, and we've been hearing about them, are having on the energy sector as viewed through the lens of environment and climate. This is an especially important concern for environmental defenders and climate activists working in the region, local activists, I mean, particularly when we look at the impacts and the pressures on the Caspian Sea basin, which is a common ecosystems really, for the 5 littoral states, including the Russian Federation, and which is having a profound impact on the economies and ecologies throughout the region of Central Asia and also the Caucasus. So let's look first at the issues related to fossil fuels, sanctions, and the environmental impacts on the region, including the Caspian Sea. Sanctions on Russian oil have meant increased focus on oil and gas coming from Central Asia. In particular, this means oil from Kazakhstan and natural gas from Turkmenistan, which you may know is the 4th largest producer of natural gas in the world. And the continued use of the CPC pipeline, which is operated by the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, means the mixing of Kazakhstani and Russian oil in that pipe as it travels from Kazakhstan to Novorossiysk on the Black Sea in Russia, and then by tanker through those waters, through the militarized waters of the Black Sea. An environmental disaster waiting to happen, and also a military risk for each and every ship that goes through that area. This means environmental risks, it means the possibility of sanctions evasion, and the sharing also of financial benefits of the oil in those pipes, and actually the pipeline itself, among Western, Russian, and Kazakhstani companies in possible violation of sanctions regimes. The CPC pipeline has received a waiver to some of the sanctions demands, but this calls into question the ethics of benefiting from business operations with corporations feeding the Russian war machine in Ukraine. According to 2024 figures, 88% of the oil coming through the CPC pipeline is Kazakhstani, which means that 12% of that oil comes from Russia. Kazakhstan's been working to decrease its exports through the CPC pipeline, which are primarily coming from three major fields, Karachaganak, Kashagan, and Tengiz, all in western Kazakhstan, in favor of exporting through the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline, which starts at the Sangachal terminal in Azerbaijan. However, contamination in the pipeline this summer has caused Kazakhstan to increase its export through CPC again. It's unclear how long this contamination issue will continue, but it puts Kazakhstan at risk. And equally important, it puts U.S. oil companies at risk as well, since they are among the majority shareholders at all three of the major Kazakhstani oil fields that I mentioned earlier. So while we call it Kazakh oil, we're really talking about major U.S. investments in Central Asia at significant risk and vulnerable to the whims of the Russian Federation. In addition, expansion of oil and gas fields in Kazakhstan, at Tengiz and Karachaganak, for example, has meant that the country and its fossil fuel partners is significantly investing in its oil and gas projects and turning away from its green energy goals. This is unfortunate in the context of the climate goals set during COP28 and 29, and is a lost opportunity for U.S. energy companies to contribute to the green energy growth in an area that could be moving forward quickly and robustly, including in wind, solar, and other greener technologies. And while the U.S. is continuing to make massive investments into fossil fuels, the Chinese and others are investing heavily in green energy, including solar and wind, particularly in Kazakhstan, but also in Turkmenistan. Against this backdrop of steady oil and gas export, concerns about the environmental consequences of fossil fuel extraction, production, and export continue to hold the attention of civil society activists throughout the region, and particularly in Kazakhstan. The campaign to save the Caspian Sea is one of the most visible campaigns, but far from the only one. Activists, particularly in western Kazakhstan, where the brunt of fossil fuel development is felt most acutely, continue to monitor the impacts of oil and gas development. The troubling shrinkage of the Caspian Sea, brought about by a variety of factors, including climate change, and exacerbated by oil and gas extraction, is a stark reminder of the irreversible damage that can occur. Central Asians are acutely aware of this fact, having witnessed the desiccation of the Aral Sea during the Soviet period. Because of the sensitivity of the industry, environmental and climate defenders are routinely harassed by authorities, and with the crackdown on civic space throughout the region, this has become even more dangerous work. Furthermore, the war has only increased the pressure on civil society throughout the region, including in Central Asia. Activists are under more threat than they have ever been, as authoritarian governments strengthen with impunity. Putin's hold on Russia and the crackdown on civic space in the aftermath of the full-scale invasion are felt throughout the region. Legislation that mimics Russian anti-civil society laws threatens civic groups, including environmental and climate defenders, as well as labor, independent journalists, and other activists who work with unions and oil workers. In addition, the influx of civic activists from Russia, many of whom have fled and are fleeing, repressive legislation, and a continuing crackdown on civil society organizations and activists has only increased pressure on activists in the region more broadly. This pressure includes harassment from the authorities, but also competition for resources, including from Western funders. And with the severe reduction of U.S. foreign assistance over the past 7 months, this has made the situation even more troubling. Perhaps most troubling of all, however, is the weakening of support for civil society in international arenas in which civic actors have traditionally felt support and like-mindedness from international actors and relied on that support for their own safety and security. So what can the U.S., including the Helsinki Commission, do in this environment? Continuing to support Ukraine is critical, not only to stop the tragic devastation of the war, but also to hold firm with our allies throughout Central Asia, both governmental and non-governmental. The best defense against Russian aggression in Ukraine and elsewhere is a strong and vibrant civil society throughout the region, including, and perhaps especially, in Central Asia. Providing support to civic actors in Central Asia, whether through civil society programs, educational exchanges, professional trainings and expert seminars, or other engagement, is key. The U.S. has been seen as a trusted and long-standing partner. We need to continue that relationship. Supporting democracy throughout the region means supporting civil society, including youth. Whether through grants, professional trainings and exchanges, or the other types of activities I just mentioned, having an ongoing presence is crucial. And support for the rule of law, independent journalism, independent civic activists, education, climate and environmental defenders, and others building free and democratic societies is critical. The U.S. has traditionally been a leader in this sphere and must continue to support democracy in Central Asia and in the region more broadly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we're going to move now to question and answer session, and I will open it up to questions from the audience, so start thinking. But before we do that, Mr. Doggett, would you like to either make a comment or ask a question?
Perhaps a little of both, and thank you very much for the comments that each of you have offered, very insightful. I think, Ms. Waters, I want to pick up on where you left off. Certainly, first, in looking at all these countries on independent journalism, because there seems to be absolutely no interest in independent journalism in any of them. I note the kicking out of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty in Kyrgyzstan, and the recent rejection of credentials in Kazakhstan for independent journalism. Is there something I'm overlooking? Is there, I can extend it to your colleagues, but is there any place that we're seeing true respect for freedom of the press in any of these countries?
Thank you for the question. I think you're absolutely right that there has been, particularly in the last couple of years, increased pressure on independent journalists. Kyrgyzstan is a good example. Kazakhstan is another example. We have Turkmenistan, where there is virtually no independent press to speak of, and in fact, journalists who work with organizations like Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and other Western media outlets risk being imprisoned, disappearing, being beaten up, being threatened in many ways. So I would say, no, I mean, maybe my colleagues have some specific examples that I'm not aware of, but we're seeing this steady deterioration throughout the region with regard to independent journalism, independent civic activism, respect for the rule of law, democratic support, challenging the authorities in any way. And of course, independent journalism is sort of the backbone of that, and I think, you know, the major threat to authoritarians.
I have those concerns, as well as all the concerns you raised about the environment for our country, as well as those countries. And it's very troubling that one of the most recent so-called pocket rescissions of the president was directed directly at democracy promotion programs of the type that you say have made a difference in the past. My questions really go to human rights more generally. When you say that this is a time when activists face more threat than ever, is this then not a time, as several of these countries have repeatedly requested, that they should be relieved of all their obligations under Jackson-Vanik?
That's a tough question, and I don't know, maybe my colleagues have some answers too. I think we need to hold these governments to account. I don't know, honestly, how effective all of the various types of sanctions can be, but I think we have tools and mechanisms like Jackson-Vanik in our pockets, and we should consider them and we should use them. The situation is not, what I would say is the situation, in my experience, does not get better when we sit back and wait. It does not get better when we see a tiny, minor opening and think, oh, maybe we need to give them a little bit more time. We have standards, and we should hold ourselves and our allies to those standards, particularly when it comes to democracy, particularly when it comes to the rule of law.
Thank you. Sadly,
I
this
think-
administration seems to have no interest in these issues, and
We
it's
have
unfortunate.
one more answer
Yes,
on Jackson
please.
Vanek.
So I think Kate hit the nail on the head. Jackson Vanek is a difficult problem. This was a piece of legislation that was adopted specifically for
different
Jewish
purpose.
immigration in the Soviet era.
Right.
It is used often for other purposes. And I think from my former perch in the White House as National Security Council Director, it was very problematic for us because it's the wrong tool for what we were trying to do. Countries have agreed to abide by certain human rights commitments and should be held to those standards as well. Jackson Vanek is sort of taking a Phillips screwdriver instead of a hammer. And I think, you know, that's where, to a degree, I agree, you need to have that dialogue. You need to be able to have the appropriate tools. I don't know that Jackson Vanek, in fact, I don't believe Jackson Vanek is the right tool. Because we use that for the wrong purpose, then it sort of deflates and deflects.
I'm inclined to
from-
agree with you. It's not the right tool, but with this administration, it might be the only tool we have.
That's a different issue.
And that's the problem. I'll ask you also about the amount of, since I'm very pleased to hear your comments about the war in Ukraine, of course, and the importance of our involvement there, but the extent to which particularly Kazakhstan, but some of the other countries as well, have been major locations for transshipment to get dual-use technologies to the Russians and assist them in the aggression that they have against Ukraine.
I'm so glad you actually raised that. Again, from my former position, both in the Trump and Biden administrations, I was particularly pleased with the engagement with governments who worked very hard and were very concerned about the imposition of secondary sanctions on their economies. And in fact, a couple of them literally had our OFAC people on speed dial to raise issues and concerns with them, and there was a great partnership there. The problem is they're not in control of everything that's running through their countries. And so one of the challenges and one of the opportunities for partnership with them is to be able to help enfranchise them, to be able to monitor more of what is going through their countries. And they don't have that capability at this point. And one can argue that, oh, that's a very comforting, easy way to slide things through. I know the governments, people I've spoken with, are very concerned, specifically of the issue of secondary sanctions and what it could mean for their economies. They're dead serious about trying to counter that. The issue is, what tools do they have?
Thank you very much, and the comments of each of you.
Thank you. I'll start with a couple more follow-ups as the moderator's prerogative before we open it up to other questions. Just to follow up on this last point on sanctions. So one recommendation is to work with the countries in Central Asia to build their capacity to help enforce the sanctions. Are there any things that the United States should do, particularly legislatively, to tighten any loopholes or to otherwise help strengthen sanctions enforcement in the region?
I will speak to what I have heard from Central Asian diplomats and officials as to a request that sanctions be very specific as possible, and not broad in the way that they're written, because it's very, if you just as an example, if you say no toys, it's a lot harder, than if no toy drones that could be used, on a combat. So I think one of the big complaints that I've had is, and a lot of work that Eric was involved in was trying to narrow those definitions so we know what's, in the green line and what's in the red line in terms of what we can and can't, export under the sanctions.
I want to just add one point here, a little bit broader maybe than Central Asia, but in terms of effectiveness with sanctions, particularly with regard to oil and gas. And as I said, it's a broader issue, but when we start talking about oil and fossil fuels being transported over the seas and over the oceans, this is a tremendously opaque area for trade. Huge, massive, gaping holes in what's actually happening. So when you look, I mean, there's been a lot of work done on Russia's shadow fleet, for example, but the gaping holes in monitoring and just sort of understanding who's shipping what where, ships going off radar for 2 and 3 days at a time and coming back, ship-to-ship transfers happening at sea, in the Black Sea, in European water, in international waters, with no, like, there's no oversight. And to me, part of the work that our team has been doing is sort of looking into this and how is this even happening? Like, why doesn't anybody understand this? And I'm oversimplifying right now in my comments, but that's an area where we need more oversight, we need more regulation, we need more greater understanding of what's happening to control not just piracy, but what's happening on these ships. And a lot of that oil that's being transferred through these ship-to-ship transfers is Russian oil on Russian shadow fleet ships with who knows what else there. Who's working those ships? What kind of conditions are they working in? Are they getting paid? Are we talking about slave labor? I mean, there's all kinds of questions that come up when we start to think about that. So I think overall, in terms of governance issues, that's an area that we really don't have much information at all.
Thank you. And then one follow-up question on the issue of foreign fighters and extremism. We're seeing, as you were saying, a lot of Central Asians being recruited in Russia, migrant workers in Russia, but also through terrorist networks. We're also seeing reports of Central Asian children, students, being recruited to schools in Russia and then actually being put to work to make drones for the war in Ukraine. When the Central Asians that are fighting on either side return, or if they return to a terrorist network like ISIS, they'll return with skills of working with very modern war technology, with drones, with other things. What kind of security risk does this pose, and how can we work with the Central Asians? And I will say for the Central Asian countries, it's of course illegal for their citizens to fight in Ukraine. So they are actually arresting someone on the way back home. But perhaps we could address that issue a little more.
So I think I want to connect this to a question that you asked about the media. And with the decline of the availability of normal, traditional media, what we've seen is that the information sphere is not empty. It's not empty in Central Asia. People have gone to Signal, WhatsApp, these self-contained, non-transparent sources of information, Telegram. This is where, a lot of the recruitment, this is how ISIS gets at labor migrants. It's also how labor migrants and Russians living abroad talk to their own communities, right? But if you take media and you put it into this closed system, I think it's a petri dish for recruitment of radicals. It's also a petri dish for Russians to recruit people into their service on their side in this war. One of the things that I will say about sort of the longer term effects of this is we have experienced the Central Asian countries, to their credit, were very ahead of the curve in bringing back the foreign fighters and their families from Al-Hol camp and from ISIS after the caliphate was destroyed. They were the first in line, the Central Asian countries, to bring both the men who were fighters and the women and children who had found their way to the Islamic State, bring them back and work at reintegration. So there is a tradition, there's a momentum in these countries to try to figure out how to take these complicated returnees and find ways to reintegrate them into society. A lot of this has to do, for instance, in Tajikistan with the history of their own civil war and reintegrating the sides after that. But I think, this is an area where we, the United States and the West more broadly, can be very helpful, because while they, it's one thing to get them on the C-130 and bring them home. It's one thing to find ways to get them home. It's another thing to deal with the long-term trauma. It's deal with the educational backfill of kids whose education have been disrupted. How to reintegrate them into society in a way that doesn't lead them right back into the situation they were before they were recruited. These are areas where the United States and the outside world can help them, in the knowledge of how to deal with long-term trauma care with children or other aspects of this. And they've been very open over the last 5-10 years in receiving that assistance from us as a group. One of the things that they're very good at is sharing with each other, how they're doing this reintegration work. Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have been really at the forefront of this, and I think that's a positive thing to think about in the long term as we deal with the long-term ramifications of people coming back from this Ukraine fight.
Thank you. I think we have time for a few questions from the audience. So if you would raise your hand, and then if you would come up here to the podium and introduce yourself. And I think you have to press the button on the microphone. So who may I give? The woman in the second row. Would you like to be first?
Hello. First of all, good afternoon, and thank you for coming in. All of you are obviously experts in your fields, and I really value getting to hear you. My question is kind of pertinent to one of the initial things that you referenced, and it is with economic diversification in these countries. How would you, if you were to recommend directly to policymakers, advise that Congress could directly incentivize U.S. businesses to invest in these countries, especially with competing with other countries who have more state-centralized systems of investment and are able to utilize that currency more directly in certain ways? How would you incentivize U.S. businesses to invest, as well as policymakers to potentially take government funds and put it into these countries?
Good question. And could you introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. My name is Miss Julia Grace.
Thank you. Okay.
Great question. Unfortunately, we lost probably our greatest tool of soft power using USAID and other programs which promoted engagement between U.S. business and helped foster relations with these countries overseas. I think returning some kind of funding, I suppose at this point now, to the State Department to be able to actually target opportunities for U.S. business. Certainly seeing embassies in the region, we could do it here as well, but having the kinds of trade fairs and gatherings of specific sectors for investment, so strategic minerals, rare earths, but also mineral processing, refining. These are related but different subjects, and certainly areas of great interest for the region to develop. I think the other areas where we have tremendous opportunities to help these countries is in this kind of soft infrastructure work that's so critical, that enfranchises our business to be able to work there, so that they're able to repatriate their profits from a region. You need licit systems to be able to make that happen. I think there are a lot of steps along that way, but at this point, the major tools that we've used in the past, we don't have at this point. So it's going to be putting a lot on the shoulders of our diplomats in posts to try and create venues and create opportunities to essentially enable our business people to meet with government officials and others in these countries. Certainly trade delegations and that sort of thing are very important. The White House has signaled an interest in this sort of engagement, but making it work obviously is something that will require kind of a focused attention and potentially a strategy.
Thank you very much. So I see Dr. Pérouse on the front row.
Thank you very much. I'm Sébastien Pérouse. I'm the director of the Treasure Program at George Washington University. So I was wondering if you could say a few words on to what extent the war in Ukraine has impacted how Central Asian governments view Russia as a security guarantor, and especially what kind of impact this is having on the credibility of the CSTO. And if I may, a second question, because I found very interesting to see that Putin called before and after he met with President Trump in Alaska, he called each of the Central Asian presidents. So I was wondering, what do you think that meant, and how could the countries of Central Asia actually support peace in Ukraine, and could they play a role in post-conflict reconstruction? Thank you.
Another good question. I think the Central Asians have watched the war in Ukraine unfold. The second invasion of Ukraine was very much an eye-opener, a slap in the face for Central Asia to appreciate that Russia was not a faithful partner and would not abide by its international commitments that they'd made with each other, the Alma-Ata Convention 91. But I think when we watch the Central Asians at this point watch what's happening in Ukraine, you watch them diversify their own military procurement systems at this point, they're going elsewhere. All 8 countries of Central Asia and the Caucasus now have drone manufacturing capabilities of their own. I think there are a lot of eyes turned toward the military laboratory, which is Ukraine, and these countries are watching and learning very quickly. We've seen the United States engage with Armenia at this point in exercises. We still see Partner for Peace programs, but we also see the Central Asians having exercises working with each other that don't include Russia anymore. I think that's an escalation of cooperation that 3.5 years ago we would not have imagined was possible. And you look at CSTO, you look at sort of these expanded frameworks that exist in the region where more and more members are joining. That larger membership dilutes the primacy of supposedly the major countries which control them. More voices makes consensus much more difficult. Is the CSTO a security guarantor at this point? I don't think any of the countries out there would argue that it is at this point.
So I was at a conference in Tbilisi, Georgia, not long ago, a security conference, and I can't think of a more stark contrast between the security situation on the left side of the Caspian and the right side of the Caspian. The point of that conference was sort of like, the keynote was, if you're democratic, Atlantic, and European, then you got a chance. Maybe Ukraine for sure, but like maybe Georgia can hold on and become part of that. And then maybe, the Armenians are praying maybe we can, get a do-over and be part of Europe. And, they're thinking you know what kind of laws you're going to have. What do you need what are your plumbing codes going to be? You just look at Europe and you've got all the answers. Maybe they end the war NATO adjacent somehow. Maybe they end the war Europe adjacent. It was some sort of a formal agreement, if not full inclusion, into that NATO-Europe world. Maybe not, but that's the conversation. I was sitting next to a Kyrgyz scholar that I had brought to that for a Central Asia panel, And he sort of looked at me and he said, should we just go to lunch now? Because we're not European, we're not Atlantic, and we're not democratic. If you're Central Asia, you have some security guarantees, right? There's the Budapest Memorandum, where, you know, Russia and the United States guarantee your territorial integrity because you gave up nuclear weapons. Ukraine, oops, well, that doesn't work. You know, CSTO. But there is no, you know, there's no, I've had this, you know, conversation over and over again, but there's no scenario in which the end of this war in Ukraine leaves Central Asia, Europe adjacent, or NATO adjacent. They are on their own for trying to figure out their security relationships, which is why they're working together, you know, on drone technology. They're trying to figure out how to work themselves together. But China doesn't seem to be, you know, all that committed to the security situation. Although they made noises about, you know, the territorial integrity and sovereignty and independence of Kazakhstan, and, you know, at SCO they definitely went over some of these things again. But there's no concrete guarantee from China. It's not filling that void. So you're in a military alliance with your most likely aggressor, with CSTO. It's serious, and it means that they think differently about things. When they think about governance, they don't think about what the European codes for local governance are. They think about what China's got to offer in terms of management of Islamic and civilian society. So, you know, I think that for us is a huge question, because we don't really have a good answer to their question about what are you going to do to help us with our actual, you know, military security, our own sovereignty. We don't have an answer for that, and they're very much on their own. It's why they've been trying to make those agreements and those alliances with the regional powers and everyone that they can to try to create webs of support.
Janice, can I respond to that too?
Please.
On a sort of a different level, not the governmental leaders of each of the countries and the impact of Ukraine, but crude accountability is part of a big international network of human rights organizations called the Civic Solidarity Platform, and these are all groups that are part in the OSCE space, right? So relevant for the Helsinki Commission and for the OSCE and for the United States. And that network is over 100 groups. It's a lot of civil society activists from throughout the former Soviet space and Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and then there's a few outliers from the United States. But there's lots of groups from Central Asia, and there's a common understanding within the Civic Solidarity Platform that until the war in Ukraine is over and Ukraine wins, the entire coalition and all of civil society and democracy and the rule of law throughout the region is under massive threat. And the best way to save sort of democratic tendencies in the region is to stop the war in Ukraine. And the best way to stop the war in Ukraine is to support democracy in the region. And so those two things are connected, whether you're a Kazakhstani NGO representative, whether you're from Kyrgyzstan, whether you're from Yakutia, whether you're from Tbilisi, wherever you're from, whether you're from Poland, whether you're Latvian, it's a common theme. And so I think that underpinning that, we talked about this earlier about sort of public diplomacy and citizen diplomacy, as we used to call it, that thread of it, that soft diplomacy, is still really, really important, and really important to the people on the ground who are impacted by the decisions that get made wherever with the leaders. So I just wanted to throw that perspective out there too for you.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if we have one more in the audience.
Thank you so much, Bakhtin Nishano with the Helsinki Commission. Two quick questions. Last week I saw IMF said Kazakhstan now has overtaken Russia in GDP per capita. So that seems like a big deal. You look at the region and you'd realize, okay, so this is a region, a huge landmass with at this point 90 million people, and Tajikistan has like population growth rate of like 3x in the last 20 years. So, we're looking at potentially in the next 10 years, 20 years, another, million, 10 million, 100 million, 120 million. So it's a huge landmass with economic potential, growing population, and all that kind of good stuff. And you think about it, and this is a point to what, Gavin, you were talking about, you all of a sudden, if you want to make yourself a little bit more protected, isn't it a good idea if there's some sort of loose federation, if there's some sort of a commitment that you would come to each other's help if the biggest aggressor to the north, which, let's be clear, Russia has been saying the same thing about Kazakhstan that it's been saying about Ukraine, that Russian speakers are discriminated there, that, people are this and that. Every single talking point that Russia had used for Ukraine, and when we talked about it, people would make fun and say, Russia would never attack Ukraine. They are using every single talking point for Kazakhstan. They've used it for Uzbekistan. They've done all of these things. So in your conversations with these Central Asian political leaders, is there this thinking, is there this sort of idea that, I think, Gavin, you'd mentioned that, they coming to these meetings together, right? And I think it's a bit of a sign. It's a departure from what we'd seen in the past. But it does seem like no one's going to come to their help. Will they come to each other's help? Is there any thinking like that? That's first question. The second question to any one of you, it really is, I was in a conversation with a mover and shaker in one of these countries, and he said it's inevitably always a he, but he told me, look, make no mistake, despite the publicly they may not say these things, but the political leadership is firmly in support of Ukraine. They are in support of Ukraine. They do want Ukraine to win. It's just that, all of the economic issues, everything, migrants and millions of people so make no mistake, and it was a little bit reassuring. Obviously, it would have been good if it was a little bit more public, but a question that I have, do we have any data about how people on the ground feel about this? Because for decades, obviously, Russia has been sort of that north, shining star, because I think that's a longer term, that's how we get to real change in that region. Anyway, thank you so much.
Okay, let me do a quick response. Yes, I would say, they are sympathetic towards Ukraine, but they don't bring that out publicly. This is part of what I've been talking about in terms of, with a multi-vector foreign policy, a balanced foreign policy. You try not to comment on things that are not of direct import to you. They also are generally sympathetic toward Uyghurs, but they're not coming out with strong statements on Uyghurs. I imagine, you could say the same of what's going on in Gaza, but they're not going to come out with statements on that because that's not of immediate import to what they're doing. As to the populations, there have been some public opinion surveys. I think, to summarize, a little bit different per country. Kazakhstan is a little more wary of what's going on in Russia. Kyrgyzstan, it's very 50-50. But there is about a 50-50, maybe 60-40 split of people who support Russia because of the predominance. What news media they do have is, ORT channel, USSR channel 1, so they're exposed to that. This has been a problem for RFARL and USAID programming for a long time, which is that they get most of their information about the outside world, not Central Asia. The outside world they get through Russian media. So, Kyrgyzstan doesn't have correspondence in Buenos Aires. So anything they learn about Argentina is going to be through that, that Russian lens. So it's pretty evenly split, and you hear stories of, Ramadan and Nowruz celebrations, the equivalent of Thanksgiving dinner here being, a political fight. You get that, you hear that in Central Asia where, people are on both sides. You see, in some cases, the villages where you've got young men fighting on both sides. So this is different than ISIS in Syria and Iraq, which might have well been Mars for all it meant to the people there. This is much more divisive within those societies as a whole. In terms of the first question, coming together, So my former students here in the front row know that I've made them take the declarations from the meeting with Xi Jinping, the Xi'an Declaration, and the New York Declaration with Biden, and then the declaration with Modi and the declaration with Putin, and do a side-by-side rack and stack. And you can see them, the Central Asians have talking points which they have agreed on, all 5 of them, and they insert in all of these conversations when they go out and they meet these people. If you want to see what they don't agree on, you look at the communiques that come out of their, in their annual presidential consultative meetings with each other, and they come out and you can see where they're not quite, where they're still working their way to some conclusion. But out of that, was it 3 years ago in Chulpan-Ata in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan came up with a treaty which talks about a lot of things that you talk about. A treaty of mutual support and understanding, where they were doing things like, say, we will renounce the use of force against each other. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan signed it immediately. The T countries, Tajikistan and Turkmenistan, said, well, we got to get that through our parliaments first, which was an excuse, but Tajikistan just signed it. So there is now the beginnings of a treaty. I think the thing to understand here is generational. These countries came out of the Soviet Union and their main task was define themselves. They'd never been independent countries. It's not like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, right? They had never been independent countries, and they spent 30-ish years defining themselves often against each other. I can remember asking, at USAID meetings or something, I'd say, have you, discussed this with any of your neighboring countries? They're like, oh yeah, we talked with Indonesia and India and Poland about this. It's like, what about your neighbors, So they were defining themselves often against each other. And we had sort of personalities with Karimov and Nazarbayev and others that didn't get along with each other. And we had generational change in the leadership. And I think Ukraine has been the catalyst for them to say, maybe we need to think about our Central Asianness, more than our individualness. They've had a generation to define that. The young people in these countries speak, the language. They were born in that country. They weren't born in the Soviet Union. And so now they've got an opportunity to do that. And there's momentum behind that. They don't have a, ASEAN, they don't have an Organization of American States like thing, but that's not to be excluded in the future.
If I can, fabulous, great questions, just good stuff. Kazakhstan's GDP larger than Russia's. Could you have imagined that a few years ago? I mean, it's not even on a board of amazing things that'll never happen. Just not even fathomable. That's this kind of change that's taking place in this broad region. Change is so rapid. And what you see is, and it was triggered by this second invasion of Ukraine. I think the first one was certainly a wake-up call, but this second invasion basically pushed these countries to get into gear. And you see increasing cooperation between these countries on a daily basis. And it's reaching across the Caspian Sea now. And so you have a C5 meeting between the 5 heads of state, which never used to happen. But now they talk to each other. They talk to each other regularly. They go on field trips all over and sign agreements everywhere. But they're used to working and talking to each other now, which they're more comfortable doing that. They raise difficult issues among themselves. They talk about climate change and water usage issues, which we created a C5+1 process in the United States side to be able to raise difficult issues that they couldn't raise among themselves. We would raise it, and then they could discuss it. They're talking about it among themselves now. It's organic that's taking place. They're reaching across the Caspian Sea. Azerbaijan, the president of Azerbaijan, now attends these C5 meetings. We see a peace process taking place. We see
talk to each other.
They're all talking to each other. They're all, breaking bread with each other. And that's not something that used to happen at all. There was, before this war, there was virtually no trade between these countries at all, which seems almost impossible to believe. But now there is just trade between the countries themselves in Central Asia doubles and doubles and doubles again because they're learning to cooperate and work with each other. So are they going to come to each other's defense? They're already talking about it because they do realize who else are they going to call? They are very much a more cooperative group of countries. Your second question, one of the things I think that's really interesting is there is a generational difference. You look at younger people in these countries and how they format their own thinking, what is important to them versus the older generations. Older generations still look to Russia, cleave to Russia to a degree, but younger generations are much more global than their parents or grandparents were. They're much more connected. They've got this, they are plugged in, turned on, they got VPNs, they're ready to go. And, they are more worldly. They're more exposed. Their awareness of what's taking place in the world is much broader. And so they don't have those Soviet-imposed strictures that I think older generations do have. And with that, I think, the prospects for this region to more globally integrate just continue to grow as they age into the system and become more forceful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody. We're a bit over time, but not too much, so we'll end there, and thank you very much for coming.